Hey guys, support for this week's episode comes from our friends at Manscaped, the #1 site for men's below-the-belt grooming. Yes, you heard right. Manscaped offers precision-engineered tools for your family jewels. Yes, it rhymes. Yes, it's a hook. But boy, oh boy, this stuff works. It's great. Manscaped. Get 20% off and free shipping when you use the code GOODSEATS at manscaped.com. That's 20% off, yes, with free shipping, yes, at manscaped.com. Use that code GOODSEATS. And now, here's our show.
Moody looks to the end zone. He's flushed out of there. Now will throw incomplete. It was intended for Alan Pitts. And the Calgary Stampeders give up the ball on downs with 9 seconds remaining. So the Baltimore Stallions are champions of the Canadian Football League for 1995 as Jim Speros, the owner, accepts congratulations. Don Matthews.
Yep. That's Marty Long, the defensive line coach that he was just hugging and giving a kiss to. Look at these guys. Tell you what, it's an exciting bunch of guys over there, and they deserve it.
For Don Matthews, his second win as a head coach, 5 times as an assistant coach with the Edmonton Eskimos. He was on a Grey Cup winner. He won the trophy in 1985 with the BC Lions, and he will take it back to Baltimore in 1995. A decade has passed since he last sipped champagne from the Grey Cup, but this has been a very satisfying season for the Baltimore Stallions. Their 13th consecutive win. They finished the year with 10 regular season wins, 2 postseason playoff wins, and now this Grey Cup triumph, and they celebrate as Grey Cup champions of 1995, and one of the happiest of all, Jim Speros, the owner of the football team.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, greetings, friends. What's new? What's shaking? What's happening? What is going on? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this, of course, is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. And that clip that you just heard is probably a quintessential example of what we're all about on this little show. That is from the Canadian Broadcasting Company back in November of 1995, November 19th, 1995 to be exact, live from Taylor Field in Regina, Saskatchewan. And yes, that was the first and only time that a team in the United States won the Canadian Football League's Grey Cup. And that, of course, was, maybe not of course, this is probably a team that not many people remember, the Baltimore Stallions. Yeah, in 1995, the Baltimore Stallions were the best team, bar none, in the Canadian Football League. And you're scratching your head going, wait a minute, there was an American football team in the Canadian Football League? What are you talking about, Tim? Well, obviously you have not then listened to our earlier episode with our friend Ed Willis when we talked about, sort of on a survey basis, that initial experiment back in the mid-1990s when the Canadian Football League, yes, somewhat financially strapped, said, hey, why don't we add some franchises in the United States, and that'll help sort of rejuvenate both financially and from a fan interest level, more oomph, I guess, if you will, for the CFL thing. We've been playing football for dozens of years, just like the NFL, so why don't we also look into perhaps spreading some of our unique brand of football into the United States. And Baltimore, not in the first season of the CFL's expansion into the United States, but definitely in the second, in 1994. It was an expansion franchise. They played in Memorial Stadium in Baltimore. And we're going to get into the beginnings of that story, which were just as curious as the ending, which you just heard of that story, with our guest this week, Ron Snyder, who has written the book, the quintessential book on the Baltimore, what they became, the Baltimore Stallions. Of course, historians will remember that 1994, they weren't called the Stallions at all. They were just called the Baltimore, really nothings, the CFLs. They wanted to call themselves the Colts, but the NFL had other designs on that, and And we'll talk about all of that as to why. But Ron's book is called The Baltimore Stallions, The Brief, Brilliant History of the CFL Champion Franchise. It's a fascinating tale of a city, Baltimore, that had a ton of football heritage, lost its football heritage seemingly and literally overnight when the Colts absconded for Cleveland. And it's not Cleveland, for Indianapolis. Cleveland comes in later, doesn't it? And then gets the NFL back when Cleveland then decides that they want to move to Baltimore in 1995. And interesting, in between those two events, not immediately, but sandwiched in between the leaving of the NFL and the announced return of the NFL, was this very interesting 2-year saga of the CFL franchise in Baltimore. That first year known as the CFLs, or maybe more informally as the Colts, but never formally because they don't want to violate copyright. And the second year as the Stallions, and of course, winning the entire championship of the CFL in 1995. It's a fascinating story. We get into all the nooks and crannies of it, including what happens or what happened to the history of this team, lest it be forgotten. And sadly, it is a lot of it has been forgotten. And that's obviously partially why we exist here, is to not forget these very important stories of times that occurred. And we are fascinated by the topic and the conversation with our guest, Ron Synder, coming up in just a couple of moments. You will enjoy it, I guarantee. Before we do so, I just want to say hello and welcome and thank you to our friends at oldschoolshirts.com, who has the most amazing website for throwback shirts, not only of teams and leagues that we like to talk about and relish here on this little show. And again, all kinds of franchises no longer with us or previously domiciled, high quality t-shirt stuff that you can find at oldschoolshirts.com. You name the team or the league, they probably have a good smattering of offerings, but they also have a ton of stuff in things like pop culture, whether it be old radio stations or defunct amusement parks or ice cream parlors or restaurants of yore, all of them memorialized in their original t-shirt form and the original logos that they've somehow gotten into their little band of merry productions there. And oldschoolshirts.com out of Cincinnati is a tremendous place. And of course, our friend P.F. Wilson and his team have a promo code for you, of course. And that's Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Please use that early and often for 10% off all of your purchases. I've got a bunch of shirts myself. They're long-lasting. They're well-made. They won't let you down. And by the way, they're probably going to get you a couple of comments with some of those great logos and stuff. There's one in there, if you're from New Jersey like I am, which I just added to my collection, dedicated to the old Action Park in, I think it was Vernon Valley, Great Gorge, New Jersey. And it was an interesting amusement park, to say the least. I wouldn't call it an amusement park. It was more of a sort of an action sports kind of thing, including a very, in retrospect, dangerous cement sort of toboggan ride that if you went off the track just a little bit, you left some skin along the way as you slid down that thing. But the Action Park, some vivid and mostly fond memories there in the old Vernon Valley, Great Gorge area. It was just one of the many sort of cultural shirts and remembrances you'll find among sports and all kinds of other stuff at oldschoolshirts.com. And again, use that promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Thanks very much to oldschoolshirts.com for their sponsorship. And of course, we thank you for giving a listen to this very interesting conversation with our new pal, Ron Synder. Let's talk about the Baltimore Stallions of the Canadian Football League, shall we? Here's our conversation coming up right now. Help me out here. Give me a starting point by which you care about this team and this wacky little window of Baltimore and professional football. We talked a little bit about it with Ed Willis, a year ago or so, about sort of the whole crazy experiment of the CFL thing. But how do you stumble into this story?
Well, I come in at it from a different angle. I'm a lifelong Baltimore resident, longtime sports writer here in town, and I was 6 years old when the Baltimore Colts left town. I was 18 when the Ravens arrived in town. So you do the math from first grade to 12th grade. we didn't have an NFL team here. So my whole childhood was NFL free, basically, as far as our own team, So I didn't have a team growing up. And there was this talk of expansion coming along in the early to mid '90s, and we had all the ownership groups together, and everyone felt really confident that Baltimore was going to get a team. In 1992, they sold out Memorial Stadium with over 50,000 fans for a preseason game for the Saints and the Dolphins, and we thought that we had a shot. And they went in Charlotte, got the first team, and ended up being the Panthers. And we understood that it was a new team in town. It was a new market. But then they're going to do 2 teams. And we were like, okay, well, we're going to get the next one. We felt really good that we were going to get the next one. We had so many chances to get a team in the interim, with the Cardinals had teased coming here, the Bucks had teased coming here, a couple other teams had teased coming here. And they make the announcement, and it's Jacksonville. We kind of understood Charlotte, Jacksonville kind of ticked us off. Because we're like, well, what's Jacksonville? They already have 2 teams in Florida. And we got really upset. And, there were a lot of people that were completely done with the NFL at that point in time. We're getting ready. This is, as we're talking, Ed Reed's getting ready to go into the Hall of Fame. There was no Ed Reed. There was no Ray Lewis. There was no Ravens. There was nothing in town as far as football goes. And we had the Orioles, who were still, enjoying the run of early Camden Yards. So there was a lot of sellout crowds. So it was baseball. We had a lot of baseball fans. But we still wanted football. But, we kind of had, Tagliabue had said, Paul Tagliabue had told us, maybe we should take that money and build a museum. Well, that made us even madder. And we were ready to just tell the NFL where they could stick it. And along comes this guy, Jim Speros. And he says, you know what? You guys don't need the NFL. We're coming in. We're bringing a CFL team here to Baltimore, and we're going to call them the Baltimore CFL Colts. And Baltimore, if anyone who knows Baltimore, we're a blue-collar town. We have a little bit of inferiority complex. We have an us against the world mentality. And you know what? We said, you know what? It's not the NFL, but let's just give this thing a chance. We know Doug Flutie is. We know who Pinball Clemens is. We know Warren Moon played up there for a while. So let's see what this CFL thing's all about. And we just rallied around it. And I just remember as a this is the first football team that I had a chance to enjoy as a child, as a teenager. And, I started watching, these guys were pretty good. It was fun football. It was a little different. It wasn't NFL, but the bigger field, the 3 downs. And it was fun to watch. And, they go all the way one year. They make it to the Grey Cup the first year, and then they win the Grey Cup the second year. And it's us against the world. It's us against the NFL. We have to play a year without a name with the team because the NFL sued us. Canada doesn't want us in the CFL. They still had a lot of Canadians were resentful of the U.S. expansion. So it was really us against the world, which is something Baltimore always rallies behind. And then the Ravens come and the Browns announced they're coming from Baltimore to Baltimore, and next thing you know, the Stallions win the CFL in 1995, and then they're gone. I don't even remember them really leaving. I just remember they played one day and they were gone the next. And it's like wow, they did everything we asked them to do, and we just kind of, it was like, the ex-girlfriend dumped you. They were awful to you. They dumped you, and then you go and you find, a new girlfriend who's treats you right and wants to, do everything for you. And then the old girlfriend calls us, you know what, we'll take you back. And then we all went and back we left the other girlfriend behind. And I always felt like, they never really, they meant a whole lot. They bridged the gap between the Colts and the Ravens. They taught a whole generation of football fans how to be a football town again. And I think it helped us get ready for the Ravens. Everyone says, well, their success here was the reason that the Ravens came down. No, the reason that the Ravens came down is we had a great stadium deal and there was everything in place. I think the fact that the Stallions did so well that they got 35,000, 40,000 fans to a CFL game helped, but I don't think it was another reason. And I always felt like the story needed to be told. I always wanted it to be told. And through the years, I'd written an update article here and a little article there. with the various spots that I was, and just kind of updated the teams, kind of reflected on it. And then ESPN always did these 30 for 30s, that everyone loved. Man, that would make a great 30 for 30. I mean, what a confluence of events. How else could you describe this 2-year run? It had everything. It had, tragedy, triumph. It had, socioeconomic issues. It had, everything that you could ask for in a story all wrapped into one. And just never got really told. And, I said, what? I'm just going to do it myself. And it was a long process. I tried for a long time to make this book happen. And then one day I said, I'm just going to make it happen. And, this is kind of where we're at.
Well, all right. So clearly there's passion in there, right? So this seems to match up with some of your later childhood as well, which, to me is a theme that kind of echoes. I think, frankly, a lot of our listeners kind of have some pang of their own childhood histories. And maybe arguably that's what sort of, keeps that sort of flame alive around, teams and leagues. It certainly was for me. As I pursue all these other ones, right, with me about being a New York Cosmos soccer fan. I mean, that to me sort of was very much part of my childhood. But I'm also hearing now sort of, okay, here I am as an adult now, and the story does need to be told. How do you go about the process? Before we even get into this kind of the elements of the story itself, how do you think about going about getting this story kind of framed and a narrative for it in the process of writing this story?
So the process, luckily, like I said, I've been a journalist in town for a long time, so I had a lot of contacts in the industry, including their former Mike Gaffigan, who was the team's PR director. He's still in town. He was a Baltimore native. He was a sports producer. He went on to work for the Pimlico Racetrack for a long time, and now is working in sports administration at my alma mater, Towson University. So I stayed in contact with him through the years. We always talked about wanting to do this. He talked a lot about the players as well, and he kept in touch with a lot of the players. So he was able to help me connect with a lot of the players. So that was one element. I also there was several sports historians in town that have helped me with other projects that I've worked with through the years that had all types of memorabilia, photos, things along those lines. And that really helped add that whole element because, again, these are teams that don't exist anymore. So finding those artifacts was important as well. And, again, growing up in Baltimore, knowing fans, knowing season ticket holders, that helped. And, of course, we live in the modern day with the Internet. So the Internet, social media, YouTube, that all helps. So it really was a combination of old school, new school, technology, and this institutional knowledge as well, just living here and knowing the story. So it all kind of, all the elements were there. It's just a matter of finding a way to put it all together.
How many people really wanted to revisit this story? Because it seems, depending on your perspective, right, either it opens old wounds or there is some kind of nostalgia for, or frankly, I can imagine a whole bunch of people in town and frankly in pro football generally that would, how can I best describe this, almost want to sort of paper over this little period of time between the Colts leaving and the Ravens arriving.
Well, look, again, I think if you're from my generation, I'm 41 now. If you are, I would say, 30 to 45, that was a time where, again, your childhood was kind of taken away from the Colts leaving, and you didn't have football. So there's that generation there that was here, that there's childhood memories that really embraced the Stallions. There was, of course, some of the older Colts fans who, loved the fact that they brought football back and they could go out there and they could cheer on the Colts. And again, even if they weren't going to call them the Colts, they had football back in Baltimore. So there's that generation. And, I'm also, I wear many hats. I'm also an adjunct journalism, media communications professor. And, talking to a lot of students who told me, wait a minute, we had a CFL team in Baltimore and they had 30,000 fans come out to watch CFL. And they were intrigued. So there was a multi-generational intriguiness about it. And then also there are several fan groups that are still out there on social media that still connect. They have reunions. They talk to each other. They share memorabilia from this time. They've wanted this for a long time as well, and they helped connect me with a lot of the players. They still go up to the Grey Cup, even to this day. So there's a lot of interest in it, and again, because the story is more than just this 2 year this football team and how the CFL team is. I know the other book looked at the whole CFL USA experiment. This is really a story. I think it's a story that starts the day that the Colts left town and ends the day that the Ravens arrive.
All right, well, let's set the table a little bit, right? So 1993, right, the CFL announces that they're going to add one team in Sacramento, the Gold Miners, to play in 93, and they do indeed do that, and not among the better teams, shall we say, of the league that year. But the next year, 1994, there was obviously some level of success because 3, count them, new teams added from the United States, including this new team in Baltimore. So you mentioned Jim Speros. Obviously, he is a key player in all of this. Maybe you can give our audience a sense of who he is / was in all of this and how the idea of Baltimore getting a CFL team of all things comes into play. Because there was a little dalliance with the USFL back in the mid-'80s, right? They were nominally called the Baltimore Stars. They didn't even play in Baltimore. You mentioned the pursuit of both an expansion franchise as well as trying to lure the Cardinals to Baltimore. Those kind of fizzled out. What's the story of Speros and why the CFL?
Okay, well, I think it was really a perfect storm kind of came together, right? And you talked about, and the book goes in a little bit about the USFL. There were the Baltimore Stars, but really, they practiced in Philadelphia. They played in College Park. They never actually played in Baltimore. The league folded before they ever had a chance. So they were never really in Baltimore. Again, this is kind of a perfect storm that kind of came together. The city was looking to Memorial Stadium at that point was vacant because, again, I mentioned earlier, the Orioles had moved into Camden Yards. So you got this huge stadium downtown that's sitting vacant. You have, they're hoping to place an NFL team in so they could eventually build a new stadium in downtown Baltimore, which they eventually did with the Ravens. But again, when I think Baltimore didn't get the NFL team, and there was talk about the CFL team possibly coming before that, but they were waiting to see what the NFL was. They were obviously, again, they were waiting to be asked to the prom by the captain of the cheerleading team, so to speak, right? And then when she said no, well, they said, well, we got another date here. Let's see what this date has in store for us. And Jim Speros was a former college football player, played at Clemson. He had a good amount of experience in business, and he was a ball energy. He was, he kind of came in and he saw an opportunity that maybe would never come around again. If there was a time in Baltimore sports where this could work, and I think, again, the window was very short for it to work, he had to come in at just the right time. And when the league said, we're going to Charlotte and Jacksonville, I think Baltimore said, you know what, we don't need you guys. And he said, look, I love you. I want to bring football back to Baltimore. And I'm going to bring, the CFL's coming, and we're going to call them the moment he announced that the CFL Colts, we were going to be the CFL Colts, he captured the heart of Baltimore. Because, again, it's that us against the world mentality. And, for them to be successful in the field, they couldn't have called themselves anything else. Now, whether he knew that they were going to get sued or not, that's, again, he took a chance with that. Whether they're going to be able to use that name, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But he said, we're going to bring the Colts back to Baltimore. And for every fan that grew up on Sunday without a football team, and for every fan that cried the day those Mayflower trucks moved out of Baltimore on that snowy March day in 1984, they were ready to give this guy a chance. So it could not have worked, I don't think, in any other time in Baltimore sports history, but that window right there. And he sold Baltimore in the CFL, and they were ready to ride with him.
Well, so it sounds like the Colts nickname, right, was very much part of his mixture, right? Not only bringing a team of pro football, we'll show the NFL. There's obviously a market here as people have been sniffing around and trying to get, and there's a stadium ready, willing, and able to host it, and hopefully a market that's hungry for it. But it sounds like he was almost under the impression that the Colts nickname could be gotten or had and was a valuable part of sort of all of it in terms of at least marketing, no?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the Baltimore CFL Colts. I mean, that's what he thought, you know what, we're going to call it the CFL Colts, not the Baltimore Colts, the CFL Colts. And the marching band was the Baltimore Colts marching band, and we'll talk a little bit about them as well, who so he said, well, we got the marching band here. They're still the Colts. We got the Baltimore Colts. Let's give it a shot. And, I think that is what, the fans wanted, and I think that they could. I don't know if he would have gotten the support that he gotten if he'd have called them the Bombers or even the Stallions that first season. He had to come in and really come in with a name that would connect with the city, and no other name would work other than the Colts.
All right. Well, let me parse that into sort of two planks of pursuit here. So one, let's finish this nickname thing, right? Because as the team, well, actually, before we get to the nickname, the team. So Speros what's his MO? How does he go about, kind of convincing the city and leaders and all that kind of stuff? Because he's, it's one thing to kind of get folks to rally around the idea of getting a pro football team, but I guess it's quite another, to convince them about the CFL, like a foreign, kind of concept, and then two, put a team together to let alone getting a nickname in place.
Well, again, I think there were a couple layers here. One, like I mentioned, you have Baltimore City, which owned Memorial Stadium. It's sitting vacant. It's not it's gathering dust. It's not doing anything for the community at that point in time. The Orioles again had moved to Camden Yards a couple years earlier at this point in time. So they were keeping it ready for an NFL team. And the governor at the time, William Donald Schaefer, who was mayor in Baltimore when the Colts left, and took it as hard as anybody when the Colts left town, really wanted to bring the NFL back to Baltimore. They had this huge deal in place. They put the funds in place for a downtown stadium, and it really went all in for the NFL. So he was kind of a holdout. The mayor at the time of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, he realized that, look, we got an opportunity to get a tenant in the stadium, get ticket receipts, look, we don't have the NFL at this point in time. We don't know if the NFL is ever coming back. But we got this team here, and we know that the CFL, yes, it's an expansion, but we know the CFL has been around for decades. And, I'm willing to give this guy a chance. What also helped was the fact that he networked very, very well in town, along with the leaders. He met with Tom Maddy, former Colts great, who was part of the ownership team. He owned a portion of the team. He also met with folks like John Stedman, the great Baltimore Colts, Baltimore Sun columnist. So he met with all the right people, and networked and got everyone on board. He built this foundation up and really was ready to rock and roll heading into that season.
Well, it's also a more exciting brand of football as well, right? So, it does overlap sort of the later summer months that arguably could attract some bigger crowds versus the more direct competitive nature, I guess, of the NFL. So there's some idiosyncrasies, I guess, to the schedule as well, which makes it seem even, I guess, a little bit more intriguing. But so he gets everybody involved in it, and clearly there's a motivated stadium owner in the city to sort of see that. And frankly, I guess the sort of Colts name pixie dust doesn't hurt, but it doesn't go that smoothly when it comes to getting the nickname, because the Colts, owned by the NFL or part of the NFL, right, don't take kindly to their quote unquote nickname being used in their former place of residence. What sort of happens there? Walk us through the craziness of that, because I'm not sure you could have picked a more awkward nickname, what they ultimately had to use their first season.
Right. So, yes. So what happens is obviously goes to court, because the NFL and the IRSAs were not going to let this go by.
Does Speros even was he just being naive, or was he willing to pick the fight and thought he was on the right side of this? Or I guess it just seems I guess in retrospect, how could you not think a lawsuit would come out of this?
I'm not sure he didn't think a lawsuit would come out of it, but I think he knew for this to work, he needed to get the community support. And I think having that community support and knowing Baltimore being an us against the world mentality, for them to get that initial support, it wouldn't have worked. I don't think any other nickname would have worked. Whether if they would have gone with the Stallions, if they would have gone with the Bombers, if they would have gone with any one of a number of names that was floated about at that point in time, I think to attach that passion of football, that anger that they had against the NFL, the city had at the NFL against at that time, it had to be the Colts. Again, I think it was a calculated risk on his part.
A little bit of dreaming, I guess, too, right? So the momentum and the community spirit and all that can do and will kind of maybe ultimately solve the problem.
Right. And he thought maybe, it's David versus Goliath, and so forth. So, of course, the NFL is the NFL, and they've been around for as many years as they've been for a reason. So there's an injunction placed against them right towards the beginning of the season. At this point in time, the end zone has Colts on it. All the programs, have Baltimore Colts on it. The shirts, the hats, every piece of memorabilia out there has Colts written on it. So there's an injunction placed against the team, and they're not allowed to have any of TV promos. The Colts are back. All have Colts involved. So they can't use the Colts. It's a week of, right before the regular season. What are they going to do? So they end up, literally having interns take Sharpies through every piece of program and ticket stub and so forth and black out the Colts. They blacked out the end zone. They had to bleep out Colts in the promos that were already airing on TV and radio. And they didn't have time to come up with a nickname. So they kind of went with the Baltimore's, I guess I think really newspaper headlines purposes, they called them the Baltimore CFLers. That was basically at that point in time, unofficially. Officially they had no nickname. So, Bruce Cunningham, who did the radio broadcast, told me, he said, a longtime sportscaster here in town, said, myself and Joe Washington called 20 games that season, and were never able to, had to only use the term Baltimore. So it was as unique of a thing as it could possibly happen in a team. So the expansion team had no name.
Well, I mean, how crazy does that sound, right? But and again, you look at the memorabilia, right? There is almost a cottage industry devoted to finding sort of those original, shall we say, misprints and or trademarked infringing items out there, right? But everything else, though, right, seemed kind of like almost Colts-ish, if not a name. Everything else, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it was still there was blue and white and silver patterns. They had the logo that's very similar to the Broncos. We'll talk about how the Broncos kind of stole the Stallions logo in the years afterwards. So we had that. And look, when that first season, you could tell, the NFL could tell, the team they can't use the Colts, but they couldn't tell the fans. So, whenever, the PA address would go, "You're Baltimore CFL," and they would still yell out Colts. They would still spell out Colts, like they did when Unitas and Barry and Moore and Donovan were on the sidelines. So, it was, again, a kind of a David versus Goliath thing. And you could tell, the NFL could tell team they couldn't use the Colts, but they weren't going to tell the fans that they couldn't call them the Colts.
So it sounds to me that there was sort of a winking and a nodding, I guess, stopping just short of that line of copyright infringement, but not letting the kind of the fans in the stadium yelling Colts after the public address announcer stop short at CFL. It seems like every other, shall we say, informal avenue kind of just made that translation to Colts pretty much straightforward.
Yeah, they walked the line as tightly as they could at that point in time. But yeah, and it worked. I mean, it worked. Look, you talk about, in public relations, you talked about earned media. I mean, this was making national news. Nobody talks about the CFL any other time. I mean, it was leading stories on SportsCenter. It was in Sports Illustrated. It was in the Washington Post. It was on national news. I mean, you can't get that type of public relations, attention, just by calling it the Bombers, or, none of that would have happened. So, I mean, at that point, the calculated risk was ingenious, because, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars in earned media did they get just by calling themselves the Colts?
All right, we'll be back with our conversation in just a couple of seconds. But first, a little commercial message from our friends at Manscaped, the #1 resource for men's below-the-belt grooming. Yep, Manscaped. They offer precision-engineered tools for your family jewels. And that's not just a slogan, friends. I can't tell you how challenging it can be. And I'm sure you guys out there in listener land, you know what I'm talking about. The package, so to speak, downstairs, below the belt. It's, it gets a little unwieldy once in a while. And, I think one's partner can always benefit by not having to deal with the thicket and the musty aromas and the other sort of untoward things that potentially are part of the mix down there. And Manscaped, it's a brilliant company. It's a tremendous idea. And, they've got tremendous products to bring to the well-groomed man, or one who frankly needs to be. The electric trimmer, they've redesigned it. They call it their new one, the Lawn Mower 2.0. It's got proprietary skin-safe technology, so the trimmer won't nick or snag your private parts. Manscaping accidents are finally a thing of the past, and trust me, I've used the product. And boy, oh boy, it's, let's put it this way, it's a hell of a lot better than using what you use on your face to keep yourself trim, shall we say. Manscaped also has the Crop Preserver. Love that name. It's the anti-chafing deodorant, and moisturizer for that matter, for, that sensitive area down there, right? You put deodorant on your armpits or under your armpits. Why not think about perhaps gussying up, shall we say, frequently in a deodorant-like manner for your other sort of areas that, a little bit more, shall we say, personal and private. At Manscaped, it's tremendous. They've got a whole range of products. I highly encourage you to check them out. I have been fascinated by this company and the products that they offer. And our listeners can get 20% off their first purchase, including, by the way, free shipping when you use the code GOODSEATS at manscaped.com. Again, that's 20% off and free shipping when you use the code GOODSEATS at Manscaped. That's MANSCAPED, Manscaped, past tense.com, manscaped.com. And you'll always have the right tools for the job, if you know what I mean. And you want to keep yourself neat and clean and trim down there. By all means, it's Manscaped. Again, 20% off and free shipping when you use the code GOODSEATS at manscaped.com. Again, manscaped.com, promo code GOODSEATS for 20% off and free shipping. And we thank our friends at Manscaped, and we thank you for listening to the rest of our conversation coming up right now. Let's explain maybe a bit of sort of what happened in '94, that first season, because I think another deft move from Speros' perspective in management, right, was sort of an understanding that, okay, get the team, but the CFL is a different brand of football, and, probably not wise to stock it with sort of NFL cast-offs, et cetera, but maybe folks who are a little bit more finely tuned to the CFL version of the game in terms of looking at players and coaches.
Right. And a little bit of background for those who may not understand the CFL. The CFL has a ratio rule in Canada where you have to have so many Canadian-born players on your roster. Now, employment laws obviously wouldn't allow that work in the United States. So they had the option of bringing in whoever they wanted to. What he did right away was understand that he needed to bring in people who understood the CFL game. And so he started right away with Don Matthews, who's now the late Don Matthews, who was a Hall of Fame coach in the CFL, and was established as it was, a very defensive-minded coach. Goes and gets signed Tracy Ham, who was a great quarterback for Georgia Southern in the 80s and had a great career in the CFL. And then he gets Jim Pop, who was a young, up-and-coming personnel man in the league. And so like the good owners do, he let the football people take care of the football operations. And they put together a team that, for the most part, was filled with veteran CFL players. And really kind of all bought into what they were trying to do here in Baltimore.
And it worked well, right? Because they, kind of hit the ground running. They were a very competitive team. I mean, I think that also added to the fervor of this club, right? Because they essentially kind of hit the ground running and all the way to the Grey Cup, for God's sakes.
Right. I mean, yeah, and they win their initial game at the Toronto Argonauts. They're playing at Skydome, or I guess Rogers Center now. And then they come home. They have a rough game. They lose their home opener. The CFL knew what they were doing. They brought the Calgary Stampeders into Baltimore's first game with Doug Flutie on the roster at the time. So everyone knew who Doug Flutie was. And they lost that game. But they go and they kind of find themselves. And they go 12-6 in that first season. They play 18 games in the CFL schedule. And they're automatically, in the mix. Their big win comes late in the season. It's a win at home in front of about 40,000 fans against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who won the East Division that year. So the CFLers finished second. But it was a big 57-10 win in front of 40,000 fans at Memorial Stadium. And that kind of let them know they could beat anybody at that point in time. They get in the playoffs, and they make it all the way to the Grey Cup that first year. And that Grey Cup still is considered one of the all-time great games in CFL history against the BC Lions, who was a kind of an underdog team in themselves getting there. Of course, the game was played in BC, so there's 55,000 fans, in their home stadium. And again, it's us against the world for Baltimore, because again, the Canadians, even though a lot of those players that were on that Baltimore team were CFL greats already and played for a lot of those CFL teams in the past, considered them outsiders. They didn't want their trophy going to another country. And, again, Baltimore's playing against trying to show themselves that we don't need the NFL. And the game comes down to the final play. There's lots of back and forth. Louis Pasaglia for the BC Lions kicks a field goal at the end of regulation and denies the CFLers their chance to win the Grey Cup in their opening season. But still, one of the best, if not the greatest first season for any expansion team in North American sports history. Well,
and a couple of things. So by the way, that game was on Sunday, November 27th of 1994. It's also the first time, I guess, in history, professional football history, where a United States team and a Canadian team were battling it out for professional championship supremacy. Looking at the stats, though, this 1994 season, it's also pretty interesting to see that of the 4 teams based in the U.S. That season, Baltimore was by far, the best of the lot, right? I mean, you had Sacramento, Las Vegas, Shreveport basically in the basements of their respective divisions. I guess I'm really interested to find out how much the CFL League and the Canadian fans and players generally either appreciated or liked the fact that Baltimore was such an immediate contender versus, these storied franchises in Canada. Was it I got to think it was a bit of love and hate at the same time.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's accurate. And I didn't really, I guess maybe at the time, because I was so ingrained in us against the NFL and wanting to prove the NFL we didn't need them. I didn't really understand the cultural aspect of the Canadians owning this league. So I think there was a respect level of the players on that team, because again, a lot of them had a lot of success in the CFL prior to coming to Baltimore, and they were all in Canadian teams. But I think there was, again, a bit of resentment that they kind of skirted the rules. They didn't need to have any Canadian. There was no Canadian players on the CFLers roster that season. But I think also in retrospect, and we'll delve into a little bit more. I mean, they understood that the league to survive needed these teams in the league at that point in time. You know, the league was on the verge of bankruptcy. You know, the ownership groups were very shaky at best, in large part. And the infusion of cash that these U.S. expansion teams provided the league really helped stabilize them for the long term.
So the aftermath, right? So I got to think that the fan base was extraordinarily proud of this team in this first season. Pretty decent attendance. I'm sure the media following both of games as well as the coverage of the team was pretty decent, no?
Yeah, and I think absolutely. I'm looking at the average 37,000 fans a game. How many tickets of that was sold is still versus giveaways and discounted. That's been debated, for years. But there was still a rabid fan base. And also remember, this is 1994, middle of the season, their first season. The only other team in town is the Orioles. What happens in 1994? Baseball strike. Right? So baseball goes away. So what do you have? You have no NFL, no Major League Baseball. The Terps and Navy football were really irrelevant at that point in time. So the CFLers were the only team in town. So, talk about lightning in a bottle and everything converging at just the right way and perfect timing. You come into town and a rabid sports town, and there's no sports teams but you. So you're getting all of the sports coverage. So they got a lot more sports coverage than they may have gotten in any other point in Baltimore sports history because, again, they were the only game in town at that point in time. It's not a college. Again, Baltimore is not really a college town as far as sports go. Maryland is always struggled to attract the Baltimore crowd, and again, Navy has always done well through the years, but they were, they weren't the team that they are now, and they had been for the last 15 years or so. So they were in a down period. So really, if you wanted to enjoy a quality sports team at that point in time in Baltimore, it was the CFLers.
That's very interesting. It's also too that Baltimore by far was the biggest market of the four U.S. teams playing in the league too. Itself having been a former NFL franchise, probably didn't hurt. But that's an interesting confluence of events. Do I have this right? Did they actually? Now I've seen it reported. You tell me. You were sort of hinting at the ticket sales. Did they report a profit that first year?
It's been debated. I mean, I think they did better financially than any other team. Exactly what those numbers were, I've heard different things. So I wouldn't want to, again, I would never saw the actual books. There was reports that they made a profit. There was some reports that they had a small loss. But they definitely did better financially than any other CFL, team, at least in the U.S.
That too is fascinating, and you have to look at the old World Football League and the old USFL. I mean, a lot of people had to be standing up and taking notice of that story in such an early period of time.
Yeah, and again, they did it right. So many times a lot of these leagues, a lot of these expansions, whether it be the USFL or it be the World League or it be whatever, they went for cast, they went for names, they went for. They just went to try to, get names on a roster instead of the right players. And what they did was they built this team the right way. They knew they brought in a complementary group of players, a complementary group of coaches, and who understood the CFL game, and was not afraid to mix up the roster. They're not afraid to look for the right players in the college game, they. If you're looking to build a model franchise, this is it. I mean, from the front office to the ticket staff to the broadcasters to the players, to including the Baltimore Colts marching band and this, including bringing the old Baltimore Colts greats, Johnny Unitas and Lenny Moore and all of those folks who were still in town who embraced the team as well. When they gave the okay, when Johnny Unitas says, hey, we need to back these guys. Because, again, Johnny Unitas and Art Donovan and Lenny Moore, they could relate to these guys. They didn't make millions of dollars playing football. They made the same amount of money as you guys did. So they could relate to these guys on on a personal and professional level as well. So again, a very unique time. As you can see, it's more than just talk about a team that kind of captured lightning in a bottle on the field. There's so much going on around it that makes this story as fascinating as anything you'll see in sports today.
All right, and more intrigue to come, right? So you're mentioning, obviously, the CFL itself having issues, and there's still more expansion and relocation in the U.S. to happen. But so maybe you can set the table for what transpires in the 95 season, both for the team and its evolution into a new name, as well as the league itself, which comes up with a very interesting sort of lineup of how the teams are going to be arranged for the following season.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. What happens is they arrange, they get rid of the East-West divisions and they create a North-South division, which includes all of the U.S. teams and one division and all the Canadian teams in another. Las Vegas folds because they were a complete disaster. Sacramento moves to Houston and becomes, or San Antonio to become the Texans, and they play at the Alamo Dome. And then they bring in Shreveport remains, and then they bring in the Birmingham Barracudas and the Memphis Mad Dogs.
Right. And by the way, two, and actually, if you throw in San Antonio, three historically sought after markets for pro football every time there's a new pro football league that comes about, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Memphis and Birmingham were both USFL cities. Very strong high school and college team in San Antonio. Was again the Texas market was something that they were thriving to get into. So it was another big market in town.
So I think it's also interesting you get the Canadian teams, I guess, essentially stacking up against the U.S. team, sort of as it's an interesting dynamic, considering that it almost virtually guarantees that there's going to be some U.S. presence in the playoffs come along, and lo and behold, guess what happens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way it happened was, I believe one of the teams from the Canadians, because there was an uneven balance. I think it was 8 on one side, 5 on the other. So one of the teams from the lowest ranked team from the Canadian division would make the playoffs in the on the east, on the south side. So it's set up for, again, an interesting dynamic. Again, there's still a huge, I think interest waned a little bit in Baltimore the second year at first, but I think that's just because of anything. It was in the second year, it was still drawing over 30,000 fans a game. They had this mantra of unfinished business. They knew how close they were. And Baltimore brought back pretty much the same team. They go and they add some key players, on that roster, including Carlos Huerta as their kicker. They added Chris Wright, who was a star wideout, among other players on that team. So they really kind of just added good complementary pieces to go with the course. They were rocking and rolling and ready to go at that point in time.
Give us, though, a sense of the name change that occurred in the offseason as well. What was the process there, and why was Speros even, why did it matter at that point that he should have a new name?
I think it was kind of, it came to the fact that, they were getting some pro bono legal help. That was, only could go so far. They realized that this was a fight that they just couldn't win at that point. And they knew that they couldn't go a second season without a name. So they had a contest and they went with the Stallions. So it's still same logo, same colors, same horse theme. But at the end of the day, it went with the Stallions.
Do I have this right that the contest didn't finish until actually the season actually began? So technically they began the season still as the Baltimore, I guess, Football Club, and the Stallions name after that poll kind of kicked in the second or third week of the season?
That's not the way I recalled it, but I'd have to double check on it. But I didn't recall it that way. But I know it was right. It was right as the season began. Maybe it was in the preseason, but it was definitely by the start of the season they were the Stallions.
I'll put it out there to our fans. The fans in Baltimore, I'm sure, are screaming at their devices right now what the answer is to that. But to me, that's fascinating stuff, right? Because to be able to change a name sort of midstream and all that kind of stuff. But Stallions indeed was a voted upon nickname. Is that right?
In fact, much like the Ravens ended up, team fans ended up picking the Ravens later on. Same kind of concept.
For all intents and purposes, though, aside from and obviously the play, the team continued to sort of just continue to pick up where they had left off. What was the sense in Baltimore that the fans and or the team? I mean, I guess the fact that they were doing so well, but I juxtaposed that with the CFL, right, which you mentioned was a bit wobbly. Was it kind of a Pyrrhic kind of haughtiness or victory, so to speak, or was they feel like they were really onto something, and this was just year 2 of it?
I think it was the fans were, look, I think it was this was year 2 of it. I think they were still learning the CFL, and I just felt like they felt like there were some good teams and there were some bad teams. I mean, look, San Antonio was a solid team. And BC in that league was a solid team. Calgary was a solid team. So there were a lot of good teams, and like we see in sports, there were some really bad teams too. And I think there was a sense of, we came so close last year. We want to bring a championship back to Baltimore. And it was they were, other than a little blip in the schedule, you talk about that 95 season. They had a stretch there where they lost 2 in a row. But they played between July 29th and August 12th, so that's about 14 days. They played 4 games in about 14 days. Imagine doing that in the NFL, and in the CFL they did it with a 36-man roster. So they lost 2 of those games there where they had to go from they won at Birmingham 36-8. Then they traveled 3 days later to go to Edmonton where they won. Then 4 days later they played in Calgary, and then 6 days later after that they played at home against Memphis. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4 cities, 2 countries in 14 days with the 36-man roster, and they still came out winning 2 of those 4 games.
Yeah, and I think in the stands, it's also pretty amazing that they were still the second highest drawing team, even though baseball had come back versus, say, 94. Can you maybe walk us a little bit through sort of the final weeks of that season? Because not only were they, on the march and winning impressively the Grey Cup that season, but there was also a bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes that kind of ultimately made it truly a Pyrrhic victory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you talk about, first off, the things going on outside of football. You talk about the Orioles again. We're still drawing 47,000 fans. Remember, 1995 was the year Cal Ripken broke the streak, 21-31 streak. So the Oriole games were packed. During that time, everyone was kind of paying attention to Cal Ripken, getting ready to break Lou Gehrig's record at that point in time. And the Stallions just keep rocking and rolling after that. That stretch in August, I mean, they go and they've never lost another game, and including some pretty big wins, 41-14 at home on August 26th against the Toronto Argonauts, 41-14 again at the Hamilton Tiger Cats, among other big wins. And they're still going, and little do they know at this point in time that there are discussions between the governor of Maryland at the time, Paris Glendening, and Art Modell in Cleveland. And there's been some rumblings again. The rumblings of the NFL returning never stopped. I think most Baltimore fans felt like if we did get an NFL team, we would just have 2 teams. I don't think people really thought of that far ahead. So what happens? They make the playoffs in 1995. They're the number 1 seed in the league that year, and they go and they are really the top team in the league, and I don't think anyone's going to ready to stop them. They win that first game, and next thing you know, 2 days later, they get a call to find out that the Browns are coming to Baltimore. So like, well, what does that really mean to us, right? They play, again, they win their semifinal game against Winnipeg 36-21 against just 21,000 fans at Memorial Stadium. And again, the November 6th is when they officially announced that the Browns are coming. At that point in time, it's like they're the forgotten team. I mean, it was all Baltimore Browns all the time at that point. You know, the Ravens were still, they weren't sure what they were going to call them at that point in time. And they still have 2 games to go. So 6 days later, after the Colts the Browns announced they're coming to Baltimore, they defeat the San Antonio Texans 21-11 in front of 30,000 fans at Memorial Stadium. And that represented the final game played at home of the Stallions and the final game ever played between 2 U.S.-based teams in the CFL. And, a week after that, they go and they win they go to Saskatchewan, and they just pretty much destroy the Calgary Stampeders 37-20 and win the Grey Cup. And then they come home and nobody cares.
See, that's interesting. So put this in context, right? So I think the date was November 6, 1995 is when Art Modell announces at a press conference at Camden Yards that he signed a deal. This is in the middle of the NFL season. I think they played 9 games, and they're basically going to move to Baltimore in 96. That was still a messiness still yet to come. But literally right in the middle of this playoff run, that in the subsequent 2 weeks that you just mentioned, the Stallions basically march all the way to the Grey Cup championship. And it's amazing how, I won't say fickle, but I mean, what did fans sort of expect? I mean, I guess the fascination that they could be talking about, okay, we're going to get an NFL team, but how could you sort of not, follow through with the fact the team that that's gotten your attention over the last year and a half, is 2 games away from winning the championship in that entity.
Yeah, and I think, look, Baltimore is it's a major league sports town, but it's not Los Angeles, it's not New York, it's not Chicago, it's not Boston. There's only so much attention that can go around, and I think again, the NFL is king. I mean, look, if someone would tell you again, the Ravens went 4-12 that first season. If you polled all the Baltimore sports fans in town and said, do you want a CFL championship football team, or do you want a 4-12 NFL team? And I would tell you about 90% of them would tell you they would want the 4-12 NFL team because, again, the NFL is king. That doesn't mean they don't appreciate what the Stallions did, but I think at that point they were ready to move on. And not everybody. There was a loyal group of fans that greeted them at BWI Airport, that greeted them for a small ceremony at the Inner Harbor the next day. But after that, look, if the CFL wasn't going to work in Baltimore, it wasn't working anywhere in the U.S. And, the CFL was ready to pull the plug on U.S. expansion.
Yeah, and that to me is the ultimate sort of intrigue here, where the Stallions become the first and still only U.S. champions of this Canadian Football League, and then literally the next season it's all a blur of memory. And interesting, you wonder had this Baltimore or this absconsion, if that's a word, or the absconding of, or at least the announced absconding of the Cleveland Browns to Baltimore. You wonder what would have happened if that hadn't happened or been announced. Yeah, would the Stallions have continued? Would the CFL have gone for another year of the U.S., or do you think it was already a fait accompli?
I think they may have been held on for another year or two. I think Baltimore would have stuck around. I think San Antonio would have stuck around, and they would have maybe able to cobble together 1 or 2 other teams. In different markets. There was talk about, Houston getting a team because of them losing the Oilers and a couple other teams cities that were in the mix. They probably could have held one. I still don't think it would have lasted long because, again, what the CFL really wanted at that point in time they talked about expansion into the U.S., but what they really wanted was the expansion fees. And what those expansion fees did was basically shore up all of the failing Canadian-based teams and help them stabilize the league. So, in that regard, while the other than the Stallions, the teams were pretty much a failure and a blip on the CFL history books, they really helped keep the league going.
So explain to me a bit about how the end came about, because it sounds to me like Speros was, trying to at least find maybe another U.S. port of call for this team if Baltimore was not going to be the place, and try to keep the CFL going in the U.S.
There was an effort to kind of save the Stallions, and I think and I talked to people in their ticket booth. It's in the book. That tried to sell 20,000 season tickets for Save Our Stallions attempt, but there just wasn't enough advertising dollars in Baltimore. Again, Baltimore, can't support 3 major sports leagues, and the stadiums wouldn't work. With the different field configurations for NFL and CFL teams, there's too much. There would be too much overlap in the seasons. It just wasn't going to work here in Baltimore when the NFL came back. He looked at Virginia, he looked at Houston, and then again the league just decided they weren't going to. Most of the other teams, U.S. teams, we're just not doing this anymore. If there's not going to be any other U.S. teams, they folded, and pretty much CFL decided we're going to fold all the teams. And at that point in time, Speros' team again was viable. They were still a viable franchise. So what the CFL did was they folded the Baltimore team, and they moved the remnants of the Stallions to Montreal and renamed them the Alouettes, which had been a team in existence there for 40 years before folding about 10 years prior. So it was kind of the rebirth. So, part of this franchise's legacy is that it brought football back to Baltimore, and then it brought football back to Montreal. In that regard. And Montreal, and again, when they were then required to follow the Canadian, born roster rules, many of the players stayed with the Alouettes and Jim Pop, Don Matthews, who ended up being the coach in Toronto. A lot of players went to Toronto over there. And Montreal, for many years to come, became one of the model franchises in CFL, won, multiple CFL championships, advanced several others. And we're really, again, that legacy kind of lived on there through Montreal.
So that to me is the height of irony for this story. Maybe this is the way we can sort of put a nice, shiny bow on this conversation, this story. You basically sort of hit the nail right on the head, right? Here is a franchise that has essentially been lost to history, literally and figuratively, that arguably convinced, or at least on some level, made the case for Baltimore to yet again get top-tier NFL football, and also resulted in the return of one of the more sort of legacy franchises in the CFL with the rebirth of the Alouettes. Yet this team, I guess officially, doesn't have any place for its history to be claimed, right? It doesn't really live with the Alouettes. It certainly doesn't live in Baltimore. There is no, it's kind of not only a footnote, but there's no historical lineage that's official for this team, is there?
No, correct. And I mean, they live on, I think, through the legacy that they built through Montreal. They live through the legacy of the fans here in Baltimore. There was a 20-year reunion several years ago here in town that the players kind of were able to kind of put a little bit of closure on it. And they also live in the legacy of, Don Matthews, CFL Hall of Famer, Mike Pringle, greatest running back in CFL history, Tracy Ham, CFL Hall of Famer, Alfred Swack Payton, one of the greatest defensive players in CFL history. His son now plays in the NBA. And several other players on that team went on to greatness. Jim Pop, the general manager, became probably the greatest general manager in CFL history. Sharp Portendash, offensive lineman, went on to play with the Raiders and the Redskins. Josh Miller, the punter, went on to win a Super Bowl with the Patriots in the NFL. They have a legacy here that's strong. Paul DiPodesto, the great baseball executive, was an intern for the CFL Stallions. So there is there's a legacy there. It's not in the history books, but their impact in professional sports here in Baltimore and in Canada is one that shouldn't be forgotten.
No, I think it's an amazing story, and this is a tailor-made for this little silly show that we do. These are stories and memories of the past that sadly sort of get swept under the various rugs and rubble of what used to be, and frankly get forgotten and or misunderstood as the years sort of roll on, and I think it's really important to kind of sort of circle around some of these things, especially when, to your point, there is lots of different sort of layers of legacy. I mean, that may not be sort of direct and or neat, but we're talking about people and players and situations where people come together and fans, right? So for those sort of magic moments in time, right? None of us is guaranteed all of those things in our lifetimes, right? But when the things come together, when the planets do align and situations sort of come about, I mean, this was a pretty interesting time in Baltimore and in pro football and in Canadian football and in American football history.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I mean, you just think of everything that had to come together at just the right time for this to work. You had the Colts, you had the NFL leave Baltimore. You had expansion teams go to two different cities. You had this expansion, you had the death of the World Football League, which allowed Sacramento to come in a year earlier. You had you had the baseball strike, which allowed there to be greater attention to the CFL game in town. So all of these things had to come together at the same time for this to work in this 2-year window here in Baltimore. Again, I can't imagine this working today. I couldn't imagine it working 10 years before it happened. And I can't imagine it working at any other point in professional sports history. I mean, it's such a unique story, and it's different than anything you'll ever see. I mean, it has all the elements of a great sports story. If you're a true sports fan, if you love sports, if you love football, you're going to love this book. You're going to love this. You're going to love this story, because I don't think you need to be a CFL fan to appreciate this. I don't think you need to be an NFL fan to appreciate it. If you appreciate sports and everything that sports is meant to be, triumph, tragedy, the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, as they used to say, community, heartbreak, triumph. I mean, everything that you would want in a sports story is wrapped up in a bow in this 2-year window.
All right, one more question, and I'm going to let you promote. Has there been any effort, any interest, any pursuit by anybody to, claim the legacy or memorialize the records and or, mini Hall of Fame or have it domiciled somewhere? Do you put it? Can it be at the Pro Football Hall of Fame? Can the CFL kind of maybe officially recognize, this part of its history, that kind of stuff? But I'm sure a desire not to.
The CFL Hall of Fame does recognize those players and their time in Baltimore. They do recognize them they are in the record books. While they don't, those records that, the team with the most wins in CFL history is still the Baltimore Stallions. They still claim that Grey Cup. Their name is still on that Grey Cup in 1995. Those players are still in the Hall of Fame. Here in Baltimore, there are fans that still collect the memorabilia. There are historians that have preserved their history through photographs that are included in the book. But game-worn jerseys are still popping up all over the place. There are trading cards out there. There are I've got a possession of a Baltimore Colts program for the first game that isn't scratched out. So, and they're still out there on YouTube and the internet and so forth. So there's not an official home, but it's being preserved in other ways.
All right. Well, one of those ways is preservation is this book. So give our audience a bit of a timeline about the book's availability both now and later this year, because I'm sure I'm not the only one that wants to get a copy.
Well, it's available online for pre-order, again, on Amazon and McFarland Publishing's website. And if you Google the title of the book, Baltimore Stallions, the brief, brilliant history of a CFL champion, you can find it right there online, right there. It's due to come out in November. And again, it should be available where, Barnes & Noble and wherever books are sold.
All right. So pre-order early and often, friends. And do you anticipate, I got to think there's going to be, there's some natural promotional opportunities, not only in Baltimore, but maybe elsewhere in the CFL sort of footprint or I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I've been out there promoting this on social media already. I've been working again with former executives and players. I'm hoping to and fans, trying to organize some sort of event, whether it be a panel discussion. There'll be some book signings that I'm still in the works with. And really, again, the book is unique. It includes over 50 interviews of players, fans, coaches, executives, broadcasters, historians. It's got dozens of original pictures that highlight their 2 years here in Baltimore, and really just captures this story. Again, I think if you really want to kind of frame the book, it's not just the 2 years. I would say, again, it kind of starts the day that the Colts left town and it ends the day that the Ravens arrived, and kind of looks at this team's legacy. And so we're going to be out there promoting it. And I know, like I said, I've already had a lot of interest from fans or Facebook groups that are CFL groups that have expressed interest in it. There are Baltimore Stallions specific Facebook groups out there that are have been very helpful with me in researching this book, and have wanted to see their story told for a long time. Again, there were a lot of people kind of supported this team that felt slighted by the NFL and felt loyal to the Stallions. And when the NFL told us to build a museum, the Stallions came here and said, "We love you. We want to bring football back to Baltimore." And those fans stayed true to that team, even to this day.
Well, Ron, this has been fantastic. I look forward to sharing this episode, and let's also stay in touch as the months roll on, because inevitably we're part of my little grand plan over time is to do some live events and kind of be a little bit more directly interviewing various folks who are more directly involved in some of these teams. We've done a bit of it, but I like a couple of live events and stuff. I can imagine this could easily fit into being one of those. I can imagine you being able to have like a conversation with some former players and or executives and stuff. I could, I don't want to promote for you, but I can imagine there's some interesting events that could sort of tie into all this, especially in Baltimore. And maybe some ideas could be had over the months. And I'm happy to trade notes with you if you're ever interested in doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I've been passionate about this. This is a story I've been trying to get to print for more than a decade. So the fact that we're just about there has been a true labor of love. Again, it was a hard time trying to explain to publishers what this story was, and they didn't quite get it. And I said, you kind of had to be there, and the folks that were there, they see what happened. They see what they went through. I remember crying, the day that the Colts left. I remember crying the day that they told us, that we weren't good enough for the NFL. I remember being excited when this group came in, and I remember being upset when they left. Again, I just think that, if you enjoy sports, you're going to love this story.
Yes, it's arguably the football team that maybe time forgot, and it's not the only one, but it's a it's probably the most successful one that most people, I think even in Baltimore, may have a tough time remembering. But to me, this is exactly why we do these shows. And I thank Ron for regaling us with this story. The book that Ron has penned is called The Baltimore Stallions, The Brief, Brilliant History of the CFL Champion Franchise. The book does not come out until November of this year, a couple months from now, but you can indeed pre-order it, and we encourage you to do so on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. I think it's number 124. Wow. Featuring Ron Snyder. And you'll find a link conveniently to this book on Amazon. Get it pre-ordered, get it into your bookshelf or your virtual delivery system to make sure that you get it. Be the first one on your block to have a copy. Give us some shekels of love as you do so. We'll definitely bring this back to your attention back in November when it's actually out for release. But again, the book is called The Baltimore Stallions, The Brief, Brilliant History of the CFL Champion Franchise. Again, available for pre-order right now. And is published by our friends at McFarland Publishing. And again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's the locus for everything about this show, not only to order books and stuff, but literally to see every and listen to or download every episode that we've done so far for the last 2+ years. You'll find all of our old episodes. You'll see some great imagery there, and you'll see links to books and other media that we feature in our conversations. It's all there. goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can click on the email link, send us some email, and get our newsletter if you want to do that. You'll see all of our social media feeds there, including Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You'll see all those links there. Just go there and check it all out. And again, we appreciate you when you do so at goodseatsstillavailable.com. We also want to say thank you, of course, a tip of the proverbial digital hat to our friend Jerry Payne, who painstakingly, get it, puts our pieces together. And we thank him tremendously for yet again doing so, despite all the odds against it. He, of course, at Podfly Productions. Find out more about them at podfly.net. All right, I wish you a tremendous week ahead, and we leave you now with, yes, a theme song. The Baltimore CFL team, even the year before they were known as the Stallions, had a theme song, and it was done in conjunction with the television station in Baltimore that carried the bulk of their home games, WMAR-TV, News Channel 2. And we leave you now with the semi-official, I think, Baltimore CFL football theme song. Until next week, a pleasant adieu, and we'll see you next week. Ticket window's now closed. Bye.
Football is back. It's a brand new day. Now the town is rocking at the CFL games. Catch all the action on News Channel 2. Good gosh almighty, it's so exciting. Catch the CFL games. Yeah, Baltimore CFL games. It's got more bomb and a lightning bolt. Come on, everybody, feel it in your soul. Football is back. Can you feel the heat? The tradition lives on. You got a front row seat. You're all invited. It's so exciting. Just to see a fair game.